Hi, welcome to the Second Rainbow Coalition Reading Group. We are reading The Young Lords by Johanna Fernandez, and today we will be reading Chapter 2. First, we'll begin with the Second Rainbow Coalition Statement of Unity. Go ahead, Comrade Gabby.
Thank you, Sister Zen. I'll begin reading the Statement of Unity preface. The United States was founded as a colonial settler state based upon white supremacy and slavery, stealing the lands of the indigenous nations, breaking every treaty made with them, and confining them to reservations, quote unquote, concentration camps. As the country became more powerful, the ego sunk its claws into other nations, making war on Mexico and grabbing its northern territory, invading Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines, and either annexing them outright or making them colonies or neo-colonies. And in the 20th century, it became the major imperialist power in the world, exploiting both the people within its boundaries and those in every other country, bullying them with military intervention and robbing them of their right to self-determination. As Huey P. Newton stated, we have two enemies to fight, racism and capitalism. Between the two, capitalism is primary. Racism is a byproduct of capitalism. The working people of the world, of every ethnicity and nationality, face a common enemy that is destroying life on Earth. Our enemy is a small ruling class of property owners controlling most of the world's wealth and resources. We must have our basic needs met to live a good and meaningful life. Food, shelter, healthcare, education, freedom from the oppression of the state, and peace with other nations. To obtain these essential things for life, we must have the power to see to it that the abundance that is available is shared equitably. Statement of Unity for the Second Rainbow Coalition. The legacy of the First Rainbow Coalition dates back to its founding on April 4th, 1969, by the original Black Panther Party, original Young Lords, and Young Patriots organization. A number of other organizations joined this coalition not too long afterwards, such as the American Indian Movement, Brown Berets, Rising Up Angry, the Red Guards, and others. Since the founding of the United States, the masses have developed a number of popular movements that came together to fight back against this capitalist imperialist system in various ways around particular demands. Nevertheless, none had established a movement quite like the First Rainbow Coalition. This historic movement was the first of its kind that established a model of class struggle like no other. Its charismatic leader, Chairman Fred Hampton of the Illinois chapter of the original Black Panther Party, stated that at the end of the day, we weren't engaged in a quote-unquote race struggle. He said that it's a class struggle, goddammit, quote-unquote. By uniting with the various oppressed ethnicities and masses, they were able to bridge the gap between the various ethnic communities that white supremacy had long sought to keep divided. This class solidarity equipped them with the material basis and class consciousness to see their common class condition, therefore, the necessity to form a united front against their common class oppressor, the capitalist imperialist ruling class. The ruling class viewed this as the greatest threat to their class rule, and subsequently used the entire repressive forces of the state, police, courts, jails, prisons, and intelligence agencies, etc., in order to crush this emerging revolutionary socialist movement. We refounded the Rainbow Coalition on May 14th, 2021, with the intent of upholding the legacy of the original Rainbow Coalition. We believe that this historic example is the model for the United Front that will best serve our class liberation. By upholding the template program of the original Black Panther Party, which was subsequently adopted and later expanded by the original Young Lords, Young Patriots organization, and all other original Rainbow Coalition members, we established our pragmatic unity. The 6 disciplinary rules that we uphold ties all organizations in our coalition to a common professional discipline. History has bestowed upon our generation a common class mission to fulfill. The representatives of the capitalist imperialist ruling class, represented by the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, cannot liberate us. It is their class intention and interest to uphold our common class oppression. Therefore, it is only we, the oppressed masses of all ethnicities and nationalities, who must build the necessary class solidarity, class consciousness, organizational structures, and a united front that will ultimately liberate ourselves. This is what the Second Rainbow Coalition is committed to. This is the historic mission we intend to fulfill. Dare to struggle, Dare to Win, all members of the coalition. New African Black Panther Party, White Panther Party, Green Party of New Jersey, Poor People's Army, La Masa Nacional de Brown Berets, NASO, North Alabama School for Organizers, New Era Young Lords, and American Indian Movement, NE Woodland Chapter. What does the NE stand for again?
Northeast.
Northeast. Gotcha. Northeast. American Indian Movement Northeast Woodland Chapter. The 6 disciplinary rules. Number 1, members will conduct themselves in a manner that will bring credit to the coalition and will treat others with respect and politeness. Number 2, members will be sober on Rainbow Coalition business and will not engage in any criminal activity while a member. Number 3, no member will engage in violence except in the extremity of self-defense. Number 4, members will not gossip nor be divisive to the unity of the Second Rainbow Coalition. Number 5, members will not act as informers nor work against the purpose of the Second Rainbow Coalition. And number 6, nobody is authorized to speak for the Second Rainbow Coalition unless authorized to do so. And that is a statement of unity.
Cool.
Thank you, Comrade Gabby.
Thank you.
All right. Everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Chapter 2, Coming of Age in the 1960s. The Emergence of the New York Young Lords. While Cha-Cha and his crew continued to seek justice for the police killing of Manuel Ramos, in New York, a group of mostly Puerto Rican students was looking for an organizing agenda. The group had been brought together by Mickey Melendez, a student at the State University of New York College at Old Westbury, SUNY, Old Westbury City, I don't know. It included fellow student Pablo Guzman, back from studying abroad in Mexico, Denise Oliver, a black red diaper baby, and David Perez, a mature youth who had his nose in a book and his heart in Puerto Rico. Among others, they were joined by Juan Gonzalez, recently expelled from Columbia University for his leadership during the student strike of 1968, and by 2 former students at the City University of New York, spoken word poet Felipe Luciano and his wife Iris Morales, a community organizer recently returned from a trip to Cuba, who would come around later on. Sometime in early June of 1969, a dozen or so of them trickled into the office of the Real Great Society, RGS, Urban Planning Studio, an anti-poverty advocacy project in East Harlem. For weeks, they had alternated meetings between this community-based office space and a dorm at sunny Old Westbury. The students were torn about whether to anchor their work on college campuses or in the socially marginalized communities where many grew up. This dilemma also preoccupied their white predecessors and Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, and the Black Panthers. The spontaneous rebellions that had swept through East Harlem just 2 years earlier in 1967, in response to the killing of a Puerto Rican man by a police officer, were sobering reminders that local community organizing was perhaps more urgent than university study. And here we've got some photos. That's Juan Gonzalez showing a copy of Palante to a rider on the New York subway, February 1971. Up for discussion that day was a reading that would provide concrete answers to these burning questions. Sitting around a beat-up table, the dozen students read an interview with a Puerto Rican radical published in the June 7th edition of the weekly Black Panther Party newspaper. His name was Cha-Cha Jimenez. In the interview, Cha-Cha described the swift politicization of his gang after the fatal police shooting of one of their own, and how the Chicago Young Lords' growing commitment to militant housing rights action ushered in an onslaught of police provocation and harassment. Cha-Cha reported that the newly renamed Young Lords Organization, or YLO, focused on a radical political program seeking structural change rather than a liberal social service response to community problems. In its organizational structure and politics, ch2 noted that the Young Lords followed the revolutionary leadership of the BPP. ch2's response to one question in particular, whether race or class was the key factor in social problems, indicated an embrace of Marxist analysis. It also revealed a deeper way of thinking about racial oppression, both amongst Puerto Ricans and among other colonized people worldwide. In the deliberately indecorous language of the period, ch2 suggested that the experience of Puerto Ricans on the US mainland offered clarity on the subject. Quote, "We have all kinds of people, a rainbow of people among Puerto Ricans, and this is why this is a class struggle. We see that the pigs are the bodyguards of the capitalist pigs that are oppressing and exploiting our people. We see that this octopus, the United States, has been sucking all the resources from Puerto Rico, and we see who our enemy is. And we look out for allies, you know. We look to Cuba, we look at Mao, we look at all these other countries that have liberated themselves from the monsters." End quote. It had only been a year since ch2 read Thomas Merton, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr., and only months since he began to work with the Chicago Panthers. Yet ch2 had already integrated the class politics and language of the Rainbow Coalition in his analysis of the Puerto Rican experience. His perspective differed from that of many Black Americans and helped broaden the scope of debate surrounding racial oppression. Like previous migrants to the United States from the Caribbean, his proximity to an island nation where racialized peoples sit at the top of a racially and economically divided society led him to emphasize the significance of class differences among racially oppressed people. In line with the politics of the New Left, ch2 also called for solidarity with the era's most popular self-described socialist countries and those fighting colonial rule. He identified racial oppression and police violence as outgrowths of capitalism and colonial rule. That day, the students at the New York meeting felt an immediate political and personal affinity with ch2. He seemed to apply ideas that they had been debating for months. He was also one of their own. They would soon take a road trip to Chicago to explore a possible working relationship with the YLO, with far-reaching implications. After the trip, they would bring together 3 pre-existing groups of students, community activists, and artists to launch the Young Lords New York chapter. These New York radicals represented a unique subgroup of working-class Puerto Ricans. Unlike Johanna Fernandez and his peers in the Chicago Young Lords, who came to political consciousness in prison and in the streets, these were mostly high school graduates and the first in their families to gain access to higher education. That was thanks to College Discovery, the first program designed to recruit underrepresented working class students and students of color at the City University of New York. Their approach was informed by their access and proximity to the radical analysis of social problems that developed alongside campus protest in the 1960s on issues ranging from the Eurocentric character of the university curriculum and open access to higher education for all to critiques of capitalism and colonialism. But the seeds of their political proclivities were also planted much earlier. Excuse me, just a second, I need a drink. These English-speaking children of new migrants became accidental translators of both language and culture for the many post-war Puerto Rican newcomers to New York. The liminal role they played as cultural mediators formed the emotional scaffold of the radicalization in the late 1960s. The premature responsibilities foisted upon them helped ease their parents' adjustment to a foreign and inhospitable city, but also exposed them to Northern racism and their community's socioeconomic problems at an early age. With scant knowledge of their provenance, this role cast them as citizens and strangers. Not surprisingly, this generation grew curious about why New Yorkers belittled Puerto Ricans writ large and leapt at the opportunity to understand the relationship between their parents' homeland and the United States. The reemergence of the civil rights movement in the mid-1950s, which ended the Red Scare's clampdown on social criticism and made the pursuit of equality the moral assignment of the 1960s generation, opened possibilities to address New York's so-called Puerto Rican problem. But even for Black Americans living outside of the South, the dismantling of Jim Crow with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act didn't go far enough. In New York, as in other cities, racial inequality came in the form of exclusion from industry with decent paying jobs, poor wages, police violence, underfunded education, dilapidated housing, and inadequate and discriminatory health care. Redress of these issues would require a radical reorganization of society. Early exposure of future young lords to racism in the streets and in the school system also laid the groundwork for their break with the mainstream politics. In New York, the civil rights movement had inspired struggles for equality in different areas of life, most visibly in the city's public schools and against police violence. Those who had gathered in East Harlem every Saturday had grown up in a city where battles to desegregate the public schools and reform the police had failed, leaving the city more racially polarized. Amid rising expectations for change produced by their successes in college, they returned home to dilapidated neighborhoods under the tight grip of economic decline. In the wake of the East Harlem riots, these radicals were persuaded to address material impoverishment and psychological trauma produced by Northern racism. They felt compelled to set aside the moderate solutions to the urban crisis adopted by an older generation of Puerto Rican reformers. Instead, they eagerly embraced ch2's critique of the U.S. colonial project in Puerto Rico and its radical program and vision of a new society, of Operation Bootstrap and Puerto Rican problems. As ch2 noted, the presence and condition of Puerto Ricans in cities like New York were bound up in the U.S. colonial project in Puerto Rico. The students who were taken with this interview were among a generation of Puerto Rican youth determined to understand how. After World War II, U.S. policies in Puerto Rico led to an exodus from the island so great in proportion to its population that it exceeded the vast relocation of European immigrants to the United States in the late 19th century. Between 1947 and 1970, 1/3 of the people of Puerto Rico were dispersed to the continental United States, mostly New York. Their settlements immediately transformed the racial and ethnic composition of neighborhoods in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. These changes, combined with growing signs of poverty among the newcomers, produced a racially coded nativist backlash by journalists and city residents that attacked the newcomers for allegedly abusing the welfare rolls. Sound familiar? Still fucking happening. Carrying infectious diseases, exhibiting criminal behavior, and, quote, suffocating the culture of their adopted city. Most Puerto Ricans, however, formed part of the working class. The experience of the family by Mickey Melendez, a principal founder of the Young Lords in New York, was not unusual. His father came from Puerto Rico in the 1940s as a merchant marine and married his mother, a Cuban homemaker. A member of National Maritime Union, he was among its growing and active Puerto Rican membership. The family first settled in East Harlem. In the 1950s, they moved to the South Bronx and kept a low profile among their new Italian and Jewish neighbors. Operation Bootstrap gave Puerto Rican migration its mass scale. That was the name given to the US-led industrialization project of the island. Launched in 1947, the project transplanted to Puerto Rico New Deal strategies that had been employed to industrialize the US South during the 1930s. Among them, rural electrification and paying farmers to cease agricultural production or hiring them to build roads and housing. I gotta pause here for a second. This highlights just how long this fucked trend has been going on of the government paying farmers to stop growing food. That's a fucking problem.
That's wild to me. God damn.
It still happens to this day. there's a lot of farmers whose farmland is completely empty now because they're making more money getting paid by the government to not grow food than what they make actually growing food. And then people want to pretend like we have shortages when actually we have excessive fucking waste still at this point. But anywho,
Yep.
Mm.
yeah, it's all fucked. But that right there, that was the US paying the farmers in Puerto Rico basically to cut their own throats because it left, you know, gaps there in their food supply chain, you know. How are you going to make up for that on an island, you know, other than having to import food to buy it from somewhere else like the United States?
Well,
Yep.
You know?
I
To make them
think
dependent.
I think part of the answer in this case lies in that what they wanted people to do, what they wanted to use the labor force for, like a lot of the farms in those areas were little subsistence farms. That was the norm throughout the world, you know, these smaller farms. Like I've just been reading about China in the 1930s and 40s, and they were all small. They were raising enough food for themselves, maybe a little bit of excess. But what the US wanted to do was industrialize. That requires that you free people from agriculture. You quote unquote free them. You enslave them as proletarians, but you have to get them off of their little piece of land. So that the second part of this, where it says they wanted them to build roads and housing, that this development of modern industry cannot coexist with small farming and small peasantry mentality. You have to break that. One way they do it is by monocultures, like they do and like they did. They're still doing the soybeans or corn or whatever, so that the farmer is no longer just taking care of his family. He's just like an agricultural worker or an agricultural proletarian.
And this causes and obviously, you know, the farmers the farmers being paid to no longer produce any food, you know, causes a domino effect where the country now becomes insufficient in food. And what do they have to do? They have to they're forced to become indebted by imperial loans to
Right.
to these imperials in the global north. And what ends up happening, some of these people can no longer live in these countries, so they have to migrate to the United States, where through redlining and the racial hierarchy are put into impoverished neighborhoods where they're forced to engage in crime out of a necessity to survive. And then they'll be imprisoned. They'll be thrown into prisons, and they'll be forced into labor to maximize profit, for the maximization of profits. It's just a vicious cycle of slavery, going from leaving your home country that has been colonized to forming to going into the global north, and becoming colonized again, but just within the imperial core. It's fucking disgusting.
Yeah, 100%. And the other thing, it keeps the market for food, like the way they destroyed crops and they destroy food is to maintain prices. That's another incentive, to get total control, not allow, small farmers to subsist. You make them buy their food at some grocery store that you own.
Mm-hmm.
It's fucking sad and disturbing. All of this removes people from their personal agency, their self-determination, their autonomy, the whole fucking 9 yards, just to make them dependent on the fucking system.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow,
Oh, by the way, Sister Zen. Oh, I was gonna
Huh?
say, whenever you're tired reading, I'll happily read.
We've
Well,
actually got a pretty short section. We're only reading 49 to 59.
oh,
Um,
nice.
Yeah, so I may or may not need anybody to take over. I don't know. But if so, I was actually going to ask Andy, since he's had a break from the reading groups for a while, if he wanted to take a turn if I end up wanting to break.
Okay. Yeah, let me see, where are we exactly? What paragraph are
Like,
we on?
well, I didn't mean right now. I mean, like, if I, need
Oh,
a
yeah,
break in a
sure,
couple of
sure.
minutes, like
Sure, I'll
maybe I
be
can
happy
read the
to.
first half.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, I'll do that.
awesome
Oh yeah.
sauce. Thank you. Believe this is where we left off here.
Right,
Expecting
okay.
the displacement of more farmers than could be absorbed into the island's emerging industrial economy, its architects developed a contingency plan. Puerto Rican immigration to the U.S. mainland was to become linchpin and safety valve of Operation Bootstrap. The economic project served the diverse interests of the players involved. Elements within the U.S. government welcomed it as antidote to social unrest on the island. It proposed reforms that were expected to placate a militant independence movement that during the 1930s drew strength from fierce labor strikes involving thousands of workers in the needles trades and the tobacco and sugar industries. The crisis peaked in 1936. When Puerto Rican nationalists killed the island's American police commissioner, Francis E. Riggs, members of Congress proposed a bill that would end or at least significantly curtail American political and military involvement in Puerto Rico. The bill did not prevail, but it set a threatening precedent to proponents of U.S. expansionism who valued Puerto Rico as a strategically important passageway to the Panama Canal, a cornerstone of global trade that linked the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Puerto Rico was also the site from which the United States had launched most of its military interventions in Latin America. To those for whom U.S. political control of Puerto Rico was paramount, Operation Bootstrap represented a path to political stability on the island. By the 1940s, the United States had found a keen indigenous leader willing to carry out Washington's mandate on the island. The president of the Puerto Rican Senate, Luis Munoz Marin, with his use of the carrot and the stick, violent political repression, and land and social reforms to quell the island's social movements, Marin proved indispensable in wresting political control from Puerto Rico's divided nationalist movement. But Marin was not just a pawn. In 1938, he founded the center-left Popular Democratic Party with its proposal to achieve independence gradually and through the electoral process. Marin and the Popular Democratic Party believed the Keynesian state intervention in the form of regulated land reform and state-sponsored capitalist industrialization were necessary precursors to Puerto Rico's future political independence. In 1947, he became a major advocate and architect of Operation Bootstrap. Over the course of the 1950s, the project transformed the island's sugar plantation economy to one organized around factory production in the cities, largely by drawing U.S. industry to the island with cheap labor guarantees, rent and real estate subsidies, and federal tax breaks. Between 1950 and 1959, 9,000 corporate investors took advantage of what the U.S. financial press termed a bounty for industry. The island's industrialization had other uses as well. Heralded as the, quote, showcase of democracy in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico's project of economic development offered the United States a critical laboratory and prototype for U.S.-led capitalist expansion across the globe, where market strategies could be developed, tested, and then deployed to new markets in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So-called third world economies, such as Puerto Rico's, were seen as major sites of capital investment, guaranteeing new markets for industrial goods, lower production costs, and by extension, the economic revitalization of capitalism after the war. Operation Bootstrap would thus serve as an early testing example and precursor to what would later be called global restructuring by world leaders, or neoliberalism by its critics. The consequences of this global economic agenda would eventually be felt in U.S. urban centers. Operation Bootstrap had fueled the vast displacement of Puerto Ricans to the U.S. mainland, and it would also negatively impact urban economies into which they migrated. In a terrible irony, Puerto Rico proved that cheap labor abounded in the third world and encouraged U.S. industry to flee its urban manufacturing bases of operations in cities like New York for greener pastures with lower production costs, first to the suburbs in the south and later abroad in stages. Andy, would you like to take over now?
Okay, a long-term process of urban industrial decline began in this post-war period. During this period, industries became geographically dispersed in the outer rings of northern cities, and urban economies underwent a simultaneous structural shift from industry to service. The first wave of Puerto Rican post-war settlements in the city coincided with the onset in 1947 with manufacturing's industrial decline. Oops, I just made my thing too small here. Because 70.6% of Puerto Ricans were employed in low-income occupations in hospitals, in the restaurant and hotel trades, and most devastating in New York's manufacturing industry, their community was especially vulnerable. Job loss due to deindustrialization began in modest numbers in the post-war period and accelerated in the 1960s. Between 1947 and 1967, half the jobs lost to manufacturing were in apparel, the city's main factory industry and main employer of Puerto Rican labor. Puerto Rican women in particular were disproportionately affected by this decline. In total, New York lost 500,000 manufacturing jobs between 1960 and 1980, but the deepest job losses happened between 1965 and 1970, not coincidentally the height of urban unrest. By the early 1960s, U.S. government labor agencies were documenting a new development in the history of the American city, the rise of permanent structural unemployment among post-war immigrants. Bureau of Labor Statistics studies published throughout the 1960s began to track the unprecedented changes in the labor participation of a segment of predominantly Black American and Puerto Rican men in their prime working class years, concentrated in New York's poorest slums. According to the studies, these young men were neither employed nor counted as unemployed because they had long ceased their search for employment. The Puerto Rican example in particular was cited as extreme relative to labor participation of Black Americans and white men. Job activity was lowest among Puerto Ricans. In 1966, different Bureau of Labor studies referred to a new concept called subemployment, concluding that in East Harlem, the percentage of Puerto Ricans who were either unemployed, underemployed, or permanently out of the labor force for lack of success in finding employment was approximately 47%. The majority of Puerto Ricans in the metropolitan area, over 50%, relied on jobs that were increasingly disappearing. In sum, the combined impact of deindustrialization and automation, the infusion of technological advancements in industry that also eliminate unskilled jobs, produced concentrated pockets of permanent joblessness among the newcomers, an experience unknown to previous generations of urban dwellers. New York had historically been a land of opportunity for new waves of unskilled workers. Despite the exploitation they suffered, many 19th century European immigrants took jobs in the most advanced section of the industrial economy. Through hard labor over the course of their lives, many could expect to achieve greater economic stability. But when Puerto Ricans, Black Americans, other people of color were proletarianized, they were employed in the city's declining economies. The new and fixed structural barriers they encountered qualitatively undermine the possibility of upward mobility. Racism in employment, housing, and education, and low wages compounded these conditions and produced deep poverty. By all estimates, the socioeconomic situation of Puerto Ricans in New York was dire. In 1960, 34% of the Puerto Rican families were making less than $3,000 a year. The government established income level demarcating poverty. By comparison, 27% of Black American families and 12% of white families fell under that designation. With the lowest income of any racial or ethnic group in the United States and the lowest level of education and quality of housing, almost half of Puerto Ricans in post-war New York lived in worse conditions than families living during the Great Depression. As we have seen, Puerto Rican poverty in New York was fueled by economic restructuring, a development that was intricately bound up in Puerto Rico's colonial relationship to the United States and US-led economic policies on the island. Yet in public discourse, Puerto Ricans themselves were collectively blamed for the precariousness of their condition in the city. Throughout the 1950s, mainstream journalists and social commentators referred to the precipitous influx of Puerto Ricans to New York and the punitive burdens they imposed on the city, its public schools, the labor market, the welfare rolls, the city's crime rate, and the public health as the Puerto Rican, quote unquote, Puerto Rican problem. Some of these accounts concluded that the city should, quote unquote, throw them out. Ironically, the term Puerto Rican problem had been coined a decade earlier for different reasons. Members of Congress, policymakers in Washington, journalists started using it during World War II as a catchphrase for an uncomfortable reality. The U.S. colonial rule in Puerto Rico contradicted the principles of freedom, democracy, and self-determination championed by the United States as part of the fight against fascism. Another term of the period, the American dilemma, quote unquote, American dilemma, was more fitting description of the crisis of credibility that the colonization of Puerto Rico represented for the United States. That term was coined by the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal, whose book of the same title, exposing the incongruity between U.S. proclamations of freedom and the nation's longstanding oppression of Black Americans. Amid mounting firestorm of racist characterizations of Puerto Ricans in the 1950s, the Puerto Rican community leveraged the defense of itself in local newspapers, union halls, and neighborhood centers and local government. Its leaders formed part of two distinct political currents: those who sought better. Let's see. Okay, I got to go down a little bit. Who sought betterment of the community through Democratic Party, and those of the long-standing Puerto Rican left. The young lords would stand in the tradition of the latter, which included essayist Jesus Colon and members of the Hispanic American section of the International Workers' Order, who called for higher wages, denounced racial discrimination in employment, labor unions, housing, and education, and argued that Puerto Ricans had been rendered outsiders by their darker hue and colonial relationship to the nation. This Puerto Rican anti-defamation campaign formed part of New York's early civil rights movement. Its largest meeting drew hundreds of people, representatives from 33 labor and civil rights groups, and prominent Black activist politicians like Harlem Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and Black Communist Party leader Ben Davis, among other radical Black American activists. The Puerto Rican left's call for independence and radical critique of the quote-unquote Puerto Rican problem stood in sharp contrast to the worldview of islanders' appointed representatives in New York, among them Joseph Monserrat, the director of the Bureau of Employment and Migration, named to the Migration Division in 1949, in concert with New York's Democratic Party and its newly formed Mayor's Advisory Committee on Puerto Rican Affairs. Their goal was to assimilate the new migrants with strategies used by early 20th century middle-class reformers to assimilate European immigrants. Their program connected the Puerto Rican community with jobs and social services, education, housing, and healthcare. They also encouraged Americanization, learning English, adopting American standards of dress, following workplace rules, registering to vote, and resisting the relief rules. This response to the quote-unquote Puerto Rican problem made no mention of the pattern of economic and social exclusion of Puerto Ricans from public life on account of race, ethnicity, and their colonial citizenship. But with the resurgence of the civil rights movement in the mid-50s, many of these themes would be raised and studied by the emergent cohort of social reformers indigenous to New York, among them the social worker and civil rights advocate Antonia Pantoja, focused on building political leadership and social service groups in the city. These new leaders parted with the term Hispanic and launched organizations that embraced explicit ethnic identification, a sign that social ferment around Black American civil rights helped foster a regeneration among Puerto Ricans of the political significance of their collective identity and their relationship to the nation. In 1957, they launched their most influential organization, the Puerto Rican Leadership Forum, which modeled itself after the NAACP and encouraged the formation of fully staffed, professionally run Puerto Rican nonprofit organizations. New reformers trained and assembled a coterie of Puerto Rican leaders to lobby government on behalf of Puerto Ricans. They accepted the prevailing consensus that the marriage The marriage of social science expertise and public policy would resolve society's ills under capitalism. They prioritize legal and policy studies and advocacy on issues of discrimination and poverty, and proposed improvements in social services, family cohesion, elevation of Puerto Rican history and culture wherever possible. When is it wherever, whenever, wherever, yeah. By 1960, the reform spirit of these new leaders suited local government more than the orthodoxy of the migration division. A small number of foreign leaders were appointed to key governmental positions in exchange for political support, especially during the mayoral election of Robert Wagner in 1961. This is so parallels what goes on in Chicago. By 1960s, a pronounced gap existed between the small class of committed indigenous Puerto Rican leaders and the majority of Puerto Ricans. The former had growing access to the corridors of power, while the rest lived politically, socially isolated in New York barrios. But with the upsurge of social movements during the 1960s, the radical grassroots strategies for change of the 1930s and 40s found new vehicles of expression. Gilberto Granavaltin laid the groundwork in the 1950s. The militant labor organizer had been growing his Council of Hometown Clubs, a resource network of 80 community-based groups that used protests to address issues of housing, discrimination in public schools, employment, police brutality, and the emergency needs of newcomers. Granavaltin had long supported Puerto Rican independence and been a fellow traveler in the Communist Party USA. In the early 1960s, he was drawing to the growing parent-led fight to desegregate the public schools in New York. There he joined Evelino Lopez Antonetti, a fierce organizer and Puerto Rican socialist, who was making appeals to poor people in the city and Puerto Ricans in particular to disrupt dominant perceptions of the quote unquote Puerto Rican problem. Like other radicals, their vision for Puerto Rican progress centered on grassroots organizing and agitation by the exploited and oppressed in the workplace and in the community, in solidarity with all oppressed people, all oppressed groups. Like Puerto Rican radicals in the 1930s, in the context of justice campaigns, they raised the banner of Puerto Rican independence from U.S. colonial rule with their allies. As a teenager in New York during the Depression, Antonetti had joined protest against eviction, watched her mother organize the hotel workers union, and embraced the anti-colonial, anti-capitalist consciousness of the era. In a statement made decades later in the 1960s, she echoed Dr. King's denunciation of liberal ministers in the letter from Birmingham jail, who denounced the upheaval produced by civil rights protests, but were not equally bothered by the violence of white supremacy. She noted, maladjusted is a word used perhaps more frequently than any other in modern psychology. And I am calling on the people of this city to be maladjusted. There are many things in this social system to which I'm proud to be maladjusted. I can never adjust myself to the evils of discrimination and segregation. I'm sure history has a place for those who have the moral courage to be maladjusted, like Don Pedro Aristo Campos, who believe that even if the birds are free, why not Puerto Ricans? Antonetti's statement captured the sentiment of a younger generation of Puerto Rican migrants whose 1960s rebellion, radical organizing, and social critiques would finally overturn the perception and political standing of Puerto Ricans in the city. The seeds of their political awakening were sown in the 1950s when, as children, they were beckoned to mediate the burdens and stigma of the quote-unquote Puerto Rican problem. Migrant crucible. As
I
we have
think
seen, yeah,
I,
go ahead.
I think that section is where Kwame is planning on picking up on Friday.
Oh,
Cause
okay.
I'm looking
Cool.
at the schedule and, for Friday, it says pages 59 to 70, so.
Yeah.
That was an
Um,
awesome read.
Oh yeah, it's eye-opening. I wish Shay was here to like share his perspective, given that, he was amongst the first in the group of young lords that formed in New York that they were discussing at, the beginning of this chapter, well, all through the chapter, but I would have really loved to hear, some more in his perspective there about the formation.
Indeed.
I would say I got some real good understandings of these questions. I did an interview. I got to sit down with Cha, my son, and I interviewed him
Nice.
during a breakfast. He was in Chicago, and I also, regularly talk with veterans of the movement, Puerto Rican veterans of the Young Lords and the movement back then. And we all like really trying to discern where we are vis-a-vis what it was like then and what it is like now. One of the things that I remember from conversations with Cha is this real clear perception of how they perceived themselves. They were a self-defense group as the Young Lords were. These gangs in Chicago, I mean, it wasn't choreographed like the West Side Story, but there was constant battles between turf battles for um, and it was a very serious kind of a thing, young people getting killed. But when he became an organizer, there was this woman, she's still alive. She used to be in an organization I was in, but she was a community organizer. She asked Cha if he could get 10 people to come to a meeting. It's I can get 1,000 people. And it was like that kind of street leadership is the very essence of what revolutionary leadership is, because it's that kind of, you've got that kind of cachet. We've got all kinds of leftists running around Chicago, calling themselves revolutionary leaders in this, and they've been around for years. I mean, they've been around since the 1970s. They've never been able to capture that. They never had those kinds of roots. You can't underestimate some of these deep roots because they literally go back hundreds of years. One of my closest friends is a Black Puerto Rican, and he told me when he first went to church in Chicago, he went to a Catholic church. It was largely Polish, and they put the Puerto Ricans in the downstairs in the basement. And he said, "Mama, how come we're down here?" She said, it's because you're black. And that was the big, that was it. That he never looked back. He's been a radical ever since. I mean, it's like these things that are not all, almost, not almost, these are biological things. The insistence on equality, the treatment of that you be treated equally well, that's hardwired into the human animal, and you cannot get rid of it. That you know, a lot of murders take place just because people get dissed. You know, like your shoes are fucked up. Well, you think my shoes are fucked up? How you like this? Boom, boom. You know, those kinds of things. We are on a path towards equality. How we get there will require us to be super strategic. The groups from the 60s, none of them ever reached a level of strategy because they were basically wiped out before they became a serious threat. Now, the potential of the Second Rainbow Coalition is to forge the kind of unity that will be a serious threat to the small minority of capitalists. So they ain't gonna play with us either. They would prefer that we divide ourselves up, cut ourselves up. And a lot of that happened. Drugs were introduced. People I know had police come to them, pile little mountains of drugs on their plate and say, all you got to do is sell a little bit of this for us, and you get some money for your group, and blah blah blah. And this whole business of the co-optation of the Puerto Rican national, it went on in Chicago like crazy. One of the biggest real estate owners in the Puerto Rican neighborhood, if not the biggest, was a Puerto Rican national. The alderman who was Puerto Rican was completely corrupted. The congressman, Luis Gutierrez, he made his bone being the militant Puerto Rican national. All this identity politics bullshit, it's been the death of everything good. So it's only the communists now. I have a lot of hope for the new era young lords. They're rejecting that shit, and you can see through it here, but it's going to be a fight. These sons of bitches and their goddamn nonprofit organizations, they're sucking up all the air. They're taking up all the money, all the resources. They're fronting themselves off like they're going to do something, and they're not going to do nothing but soften the working class up for slaughter.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said, Andy. Beautifully said.
I'll give you one funny story. My friend Hector, he was in the Young Lords. He was in the takeover of the seminary center over at DePaul, McCormick Seminary Center. He was there with ch2 when they trashed the plans of the gentrifiers. But he worked for Luis Gutierrez to get Luis Gutierrez elected. And Luis said, my door will be always open to you. I have jobs, to offer you guys after, so just come around, see me. So Hector called him and said, yeah, I want to talk to Luis. Oh, the congressman's busy right now. He'll get back to you. So he called 3 times and Luis wouldn't pick up the phone. And so a couple of the guys went over. They stacked a pile of bricks and rocks in front of Luis' house. Wait till he came rolling up in his brand new BMW, and they rocked that fucking car. And Luis wouldn't even get out of the car. I mean, these guys were hardcore gang members, and they didn't listen to bullshit. And these people that sold them out, they're quite well known to the whole community. Everybody knows what these identity politics lead to.
Yep.
Indeed. And how to follow that.
Andy, yeah, exactly as you were saying, Andy. You know, these rad libs, you know, these sock dems, these rad libs going around saying that, if you vote, it'll change things. If you vote Democrat, if you vote for this person, it's gonna change stuff. No, it's not. Voting has never done anything. It will continue to never do anything. And so long as there is a dictatorship of the bourgeois, nothing will ever get done within the confines of how this socioeconomic system works. The only way change is going to happen is through revolution. It's through uprooting and replacing this society, these social relations, these modes of production with a new mode of production, with new social relations, with a new socioeconomic system, and changing and change must come from the base, from bottom to top, you know, and you know, these nonprofit organizations can say whatever they want, but at the end of the day, they are just they're just tools used by the bourgeois to quell class struggle. You know, they're just used to confuse, distract, distort, and warp the masses from becoming class conscious and from applying a dialectical, scientific, and Marxist analysis of their materialistic conditions and the internal contradictions within our society, and how those contradictions relate to one another, and how they affect class struggle and the materialistic conditions within our communities, and how to apply that knowledge through revolution, through organizing, and through class agitation. You know, they're just tools used by the bourgeois to uphold their interests. You know, if never trust a quote unquote activist who's being paid to do what they work, because they're fucking they're traitors. They're traitors to the revolutions. Never trust one who's being paid to do anything.
You're right. You're right. Sadly, you know, we learn these things the hard way.
Indeed.
I thought a lot of these people could be talk sense to. I was so ashamed of myself, because I was an experienced revolutionary, not a completely naive one. But the game is a lot more sophisticated than we realize, and sometimes we're walking into a trap without knowing it. And it's not entirely our fault. We're working out of a playbook that that has to be constantly updated. We can't even use the playbook completely of the 60s. I mean, we can learn from it, but it's like, I've been reading a great book that Simone de Beauvoir wrote about China. It's called The Long March. And in it, she's very, very plain spoken. It's not an ideological book at all, but it's so valuable because it looks at what are the objectives of these people. I mean, the life expectancy for a Chinese person in 1939 was 25 years. That's what you lived to be. I mean, this was a poverty on a level that we can't even imagine, in the millions of, just eating dirt, poverty, and exploited like crazy. But she's able to look at this and say, they're doing something here. There's something here. This, collectivization of peasantry is a big deal. You can't shove that through, like, just because it's a ideologically pure thing to get rid of peasantry and create communes. That doesn't work. So, but she takes you along this trip and you begin to see, and then you think about, well, how does that apply to US? Well, it's very hard to apply anything to the US that has to do with the material, like Gabby's saying, like the
The material
material
conditions are different.
condition, very different, extremely different. So that
Yeah,
we're
because
living, we have a goddamn abundance machinery out there that could create anything and everything that we
Mhm.
need. We could,
Yep.
I personally, not everybody adheres to this, but I want to talk about this. I think we can move, just like Lenin moved from, feudalism. He said, we don't have to pass through a long development of capitalism, blah, blah, blah. We can move to socialism. I think that the material conditions exist for communism. The the idea that from each according to their ability, to each according to his need, that's the classical definition of communism. So that work replacement is not necessarily bad. We have that going on in our society right now. Jobs are being eliminated by the millions, never to be replaced. And I tell everybody, you should look real hard at that strike in California, the writers and the actors, because that's the future of all labor. They're being replaced by AI. All your extras, like everybody used to have a job, well, I'm an extra on John Wayne's film or whatever the fuck. And it's like, well, what if you can be replaced by a completely believable CGI? Well, that's what's happening. And they started using CGI professionally, what, 15 years ago? In Gladiator, the tiger was a CGI tiger. It looked pretty damn real. Now it's way beyond belief. The human eye can't detect the difference. Well, of course they're going to use that, and they told the actors, we're going to wait till y'all are starving and you're losing your apartments, and we'll see what you take. And that's the way they're running everything now. No fucking reforms, no fucking shit. That you got to fight to keep from dying now. I mean, they're literally willing to watch millions of us just perish on the street in the heat, whatever. They don't give a fuck. So if once you know your enemy don't give a fuck, you're free to do anything. I'd say I'm really trying to convince people, call for the whole enchilada. We want it all. We want to take over everything that you got and run it in the interest of the people. Well, that'd be communism. Well, call whatever the fuck you want to. That's what we want.
At this point, it's an act of self-defense.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I will say this. I will say this, Comrade Andy. So in your example of Russia, how they transitioned from feudalism into socialism. The thing about Russia is that they were a complete feudal society. They were a semi-feudal society. They had both capitalist and feudal elements, which is why they were even able to transition into socialism at all. Because if Russia was a completely feudalist society, then they wouldn't be able to transition to socialism, because the materialistic conditions and socioeconomic system wouldn't be present in order for them to transition into socialism. Same thing with China. They were a semi-feudal society as well, which is why they're able to transition into socialism. The thing about communism is that communism is not merely just a thing limited by regions. Communism is global. the only way communism can be achieved is on a global scale. And even once the dictatorship of the bourgeois is overthrown here in the United States, there are still going to be other dictatorship of the bourgeois that are going to try and eliminate, eradicate, and completely revert back society back onto the capitalist road. You can't have I've used this example before. You can't have an island of communism with a sea of imperialism surrounding on every corner. There needs to be socialism in order for the dictatorship of the proletariat to defend itself, because otherwise it'll just be obliterated and replaced back onto the capitalist road. So the thing about the U.S. is that revolution has never happened in a fully industrialized society. It's never happened fully in a completely industrialized society like the U.S. or like European countries. So how revolution is going to happen here is going to be completely different to how it happened in Russia or China or in any other revolution, because when revolution happens here or in the global north in general, it's going to be the first time ever where revolution is being implemented within a fully industrialized capitalist society. So it's definitely going to be unique, especially in the imperial core. So yeah.
Yeah, I think these are really important questions. The one I will say in Marxist thought, like I've studied, and I can never remember where to quote this from, but he talks about like when the productive forces reach a certain level, then the social relations, whether it's feudalism or capitalism, whatever it is, the social relations between people, one class exploiting another, whatever, those social relations become fetters. They block the development of the productive forces themselves. And when that happens, a revolution takes place. The first revolution takes place in the productive forces, just like when capitalism first came on the scene in England with the looms and the steam driven whatchamacallit and all these things that look like complete claptrap pieces of shit to us now. That was a revolution in the means of production. Now that changed everything in England. Went from being a little cottage industry where people weaved at home and brought the goods to market, changed everything, ruined the cottage industry, destroyed the lives of all the little workers and all the little villages, and it took a long time, but in about 50 years, people were out on the street eating dirt again. They were no longer in their little villages. So the forcing of capitalism, the proletarianization of human beings was a change, a revolutionary social change, but it was preceded by the change in the productive forces. Well, now there's been a qualitative leap in the productive forces of the world, so that everybody, no matter where you are in the world, you're competing against AI, you're competing against tech that you don't even understand. I have a friend who's a self-taught techie, and he's real good, and he gets hired by all these Fortune 500 companies, and they say, Eric, what do I do about writing this program? He said, ask the chatbot. And they said, oh, okay. So they type and the chatbot spits out something. And they said, what do you think, Eric? Look pretty good? Does it look right? Eric goes, yeah, it looks good. And they said, wow, what do you think this means? Eric said, it means you're going to be out of a job. You know, there ain't no
Hmm.
there ain't no room for somebody. If the damn thing can do what you do and it's can go 24/7, what the fuck do they need you for?
Yep. I believe it was. I believe it was. I believe it was Lenin, who said this. Either Lenin or Marx, but either one said that automation within a capitalist society and automation within a social society are completely different. Under a capitalist society, since the socioeconomic system and the relation of production and mode of production is rooted in the maximization of profit in the fastest and most efficient way possible, automation will lead to people's livelihoods being ruined and their jobs being taken away by machines for the maximization of profit. While under socialism, since the basic necessities are met for you to live, universal housing, education, healthcare, and so on and so forth, automation has a completely different effect on our social society because since you have the basic necessities to live, automation is actually positive under a social society because it gives you room to do the things you want to do, that they are passionate about.
Absolutely,
Um,
absolutely,
under
absolutely.
under a socialist society, the jobs that are grueling, the jobs that are completely unsafe for human interaction, like sewage and so on and so forth, will be replaced by machines. Not jobs that actually bring joy to people, but jobs that are grueling and that no human being should ever be put through. Those are the jobs that are going to be replaced by machines, not things like art or movie making or shit like that.
Yeah, and I think that you're absolutely right. And like one of the things, like if you look at the American South and the development of agricultural machinery, the cotton gin and the cotton pickers and all these things is sort of like a lot of Black people have said before, that's what freed us from sitting behind a mule, was the development of these machines that replaced the mule, that freed us from, what was the virtual slavery. I mean, there was, under apartheid, Jim Crow, there's a small difference in the daily reality from being under slavery. But, so guys like Muddy Waters and B.B. King, and they said, fuck this, I can get out of here and go to Chicago. And that's what they did. So I'm saying it's important that the communists seriously look at the material forces of production, the dialectics of that, as well as the ideological thing. In other words, I believe this, therefore this should happen. But what about, here's a scientific explanation of what were the things that happened. I mean, this was a great chapter because it really illuminates how the Puerto Rican diaspora was started by industrial development. They brought machinery to Puerto Rico, and it says right in there that this is the same thing that they did in the U.S. South. It's exactly right. It's one of the reasons that the civil rights movement is mostly not completely understood, because they don't understand what people fail to understand is, like, when Wall Street decided we want to industrialize in the South and utilize that cheap labor, that Jim Crow was an obstacle to that. It's like, oh, you mean we got to put in separate bathrooms, separate water fountain? What the fuck are you talking about? We're not paying for that. And they refused, and they were on the quote unquote side of civil rights, as long as it didn't go so far as like Martin Luther King, was starting to propose that it go all the way to human rights, universal human rights. And they said, no, ends here. You get to work and drink from the same fountain as that redneck over there, but that's as far as it goes. So,
Yep.
I mean, there's always something economic behind every political move that's made by either side.
It's to maximize profit, you know? It's to,
Right?
it always comes down to profit, you know?
Oh yeah.
And as you mentioned, you know, for the civil rights movement, you know, they were okay with the civil rights and with Martin Luther King, but the moment he started to actually become more radical and talk about liberation, that's when they killed him. You know, that's when he became a problem. You know, because the bourgeois have always feared another socioeconomic system challenging capitalist supremacy. You know, they've always feared that. They've always feared the idea of the masses rising and the idea that capitalism is not the end all be all, you know? So when Martin Luther King started to become more radical and started to sound more like Malcolm X, that's when he became a problem, you know? And as under a capitalist imperialist society, you know, things like Jim Crow, things like segregation, things like slavery, they never went away. They just took a new form. You know, everything is a process. You know, everything goes through stages. You know, slavery never went away after the Civil War. It just took a new form through the prison complex. You know, segregation and Jim Crow laws never went away. They just took a new form through redlining and defunding non-white communities, and ridding them of having a better quality of life than white communities. You know, it's just an evolved form of oppression, of exploitation, of subjugation. You know.
Yeah, it's like what happens. My question to the comrades is, what happens when they can get the production done without the
worker,
the slave, what happens? Why? In other words, like, wouldn't they be scratching their chins and going like, now wait a minute, I used to have, even when I had that guy as a slave, I had to feed him a certain amount just so he could work the next day. In fact, some people put a premium on like the slave, as a worker. They paid a lot of money for him. They would consciously decide, oh, I'm not going to whip that slave to death. Like James Madison's father or grandfather was the first white slave owner to be murdered in the colonies by his slaves. And his wife needed their labor so bad that she refused to allow them to be executed. It's like, this is an investment. And what if your investment is no longer worth investing in? It's like, wait, I have to feed them? I have to make sure they got Netflix and healthcare and education. Why would I do that? They're asking themselves those kinds of questions because what's laying in front of them is access to production without labor. To have so you have what some of them refer to as useless eaters. And that's what we've become in many ways as a class. So our options are clear. We don't have a choice as to which way to go. We have to take over, expropriate everything, take what they got, and use it for the good of the people and the planet. They, on the other hand, if they sell to just like the well-to-do in China, for instance, it's only like 20% of the population. but they consume at a, that's the whole population of the United States right there. 1/4 of China, 20% of China, 1/5 of China. That's the equivalent of the whole United States as a market. So you know, you can do quite well selling to the 20% market and let the 80% rot in hell, or you know, die of disease or heat prostration. They literally looking at it that way at this point, and that's what we don't realize. We still think that they're somehow they'll treat us better than they did those Puerto Ricans. You know, they'll treat us better than they did those blacks. That's the reality we're in, where nobody wants to believe that America is going to go down so fast, but it's already happening. Even the casual observer can see this country is going to absolute shit as a society. You know.
You know, you know, you know, I've said this before. The role that the peasantry had in the Chinese Revolution is the same role that the lumpen are going to have in the revolution here in the States. You know, because you know, so many people are becoming lumpenized due to automation, and due to the cost of living becoming more and more expensive, while wages and hours are being lowered and cut. That so much of the population is becoming lumpenized that pretty soon the lumpen are going to become the majority. You know. So
well, yeah, a lot of places that's kind of what's happening, and people surviving in any way they know how, and going to any, you know, I mean, they got it. Like I had a friend who was a poet and a writer, and he was real talented, but he was a rapper, but he was also a hustler, and he called it rough hustling, because it was like the idea. Well, and I know a bunch of guys like this in Chicago. It's like, hey, my kid's got to eat, you know, and you telling me all this shit about like I got to be upstanding. This one cat I knew, he was a dealer, and he got a job through these friends. They wanted to reform him, right? Because he had a lot of problems. He lost a kid to gun violence, got shot. His kid got shot in his lap while he was sitting on a porch. And so they got him a job in the cookie factory. This dude was really good. And he pretty much rose right away to become the manager of his shift. And he had 3 real sharp cars, right? He said, well, you know, I'm going to need some overtime. So he authorized all this overtime. And he's making the fuck out of the cookies, you know, just cookies were coming out of this factory like nobody's business. And the manager, the big cheeses looked at this, what the fuck with all these cookies? Why are we producing so many cookies? We can't sell all this cookies. And the reason they were producing so many cookies is because my friend needed money to help customize his car. You know what I mean? It's like we're going to do what we got to do. Chuck D told me this a long time ago. I got to interview him, and people were going, Chuck, this was in the 90s, and they're, Chuck, how are these poor children going to get access to the computer? How are they going? They don't have any money. How are they going? Chuck said, don't worry about it. He said, they're going to get access. They're going to get access by any means necessary. And that's the way we're going to take this motherfucker, is we're going to be outsmart them, unite like unbelievable, like never before. We'll have a culture that'll be so brilliant that nobody will be able to resist it. And we'll have a momentum, because the people need this answer to their problems. No other answer will suffice. and we will get people in droves. I think that we'll outstrip all the former organizations of the 60s in terms of the jumping. I mean, you could see that with the George Floyd thing. It was a lot. I mean, it dwarfed the protests of the 60s. There was 78 million people involved in one way or another in those protests. People are up to their eyeballs in the troubles of this bullshit, and they get nothing but insults and injury, and so I think we're on the verge of something that's going to be enormous. I guess I hope to live to see it. I'm seeing a lot already, but I think it's coming.
I would, and I hope I'll see it as well.
Yeah.
I've said this before. And it's terrifying, but it's true. If nothing is done within this century, we're all gonna die.
Yeah,
like it,
I
like
agree. I agree.
it's as simple as that. If something is not done within this century, if there isn't, if revolution and liberation does not happen within these 100-ish years we have left on planet Earth, we're going to see repercussions and death on a mass scale like never before. It's going to be it's going to be horrible.
Sadly, I agree with you. I think that it's invaluable to me as an old man to be amongst you young comrades, that are set your sights as high, because I think that's the only way to look. Only way to look is up, because it's all there. It's just being kept from us. It's the means. I read a quote. Banksy put this quote up. It's from a Utah Phillips, who was an old wobbly and a hobo, and he wrote, "The world is not something like the world is being destroyed by people." Not an accident, in other words. He said, but those people have names and addresses, and I think that's the truth. Those people have names and addresses. The ones who are responsible for the shit show that we're in are a handful of pricks, and we can take them out, but we have to be really meticulously organized to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what
We have to organize, agitate, and educate.
Yeah. I worried sometimes about the way they're drilling down on ignorance in this society, that they found a way to amplify ignorance like never before. So instead of finding commonality, we're busy screaming at each other, and they constantly setting in these agitators who get us to do that, just to do that. So that I'm very suspicious of both right and left politicians. Like when the idea that we're not right or left, we're from the bottom and coming for the top. That kind of appeals to me. I wrote a song about that.
Sorry.
No, that's it. It's like we're outside of the old limitations. We're outside of the old solutions. We're in some not completely, but somewhat really unfamiliar territory, as far as like how do you get things done? Well, you go to your city council, you write a letter to all that kind of crap, vote for this one, vote for that one. That stuff is all dead. We have to find our way out of this by being able to think strategically. And that's comes at a premium, because they don't want you thinking like that. They want you thinking just partisan. I'm this, I'm that, I believe this, I believe that. No, that ain't gonna get it. They'll cut you up like they'll cut you to ribbons if you think like that.
Yep. Fuck being a quote unquote centrist, moderate, leftist. Fuck that shit.
Yeah.
You know, because like there is no such thing as being a quote unquote centrist. If you're a centrist, you're basically just a closeted conservative. That's basically what you are, you know.
Oh,
Um,
100%, 100%.
Sister Zen, I just wanted to ask, do you have anything to say about about this chapter and everything? I would love to hear what any thoughts you have if you're there.
No, nothing's come to mind, or I would have piped in.
Gotcha. But yeah,
Well, my
sorry.
battery's going down, but I would just thank you all for putting up with me, and I enjoyed your all's company, and I enjoyed this read. I think it's really good. I'm gonna really dig in and look over the parts that I skimmed, because I think this is a very perceptive book.
Oh yeah, 100%.
I like how
Um,
detailed she is in describing everything that was happening and all of its impacts going on, you know. I'm really
Yeah.
enjoying this book.
it's amazing, honestly. Like it really is.
I'm gonna post a pictures, a couple pictures on Signal, I guess, or to the, I guess, through the chat somewhere. I hope other people pick up on this Simone de Beauvoir's book, because it's really different, really refreshingly written, and it's like 1958 she wrote it. And the Chinese, almost every prediction that the communist leadership had for the Chinese people came true over the course of the next 50 years, from 58 to 2000.
Oh yeah.
It's pretty amazing what they accomplished. It's like the greatest number of people taken out of the most desperate poverty in the history of the world by a long shot. something like 900 million people went from desperate poverty, starvation, living to be 25. So I believe their life expectancy is at least equal to that of the United States at this point. I'm going to check that. I'm pretty sure it's pretty close. But that was a whole accomplishment, and it was done by people who had the ability to think ahead, think strategically, and plot a course. Obviously, not everything went the way that it should have, and it probably, took a huge wrong turn. But even with all that said, it's still a hell of a story.
Oh yeah.
Interesting. Sorry, but yeah, that is very interesting.
Comrades, my battery's about to die. I gotta go.
See ya,
And
Comrade Andy.
We're coming up on 2 hours anyways, so it's a good time to wrap things up. And
are there?
Oh yeah.
yeah. But
Okay.
thank you for
So,
your insight tonight, though. I love
Well, I'm not even high, and I'm talking like a fool.
It's all good. I enjoy it.
Oh
Well,
yeah.
I did. I really appreciate y'all. So we'll
You too, Andy.
see. We'll talk soon.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds
care.
good. We'll be back on Friday for the rest of chapter 2.
Oh, Andy.
So if you want to join us then, that would be awesome.
Okay.
Andy, I don't know if you know this, but if we don't know, I'm holding a book club every Tuesday, and I think I might have told you, but we're reading Wretched of the Earth every
Oh, yeah,
Tuesdays.
yeah.
Every
I
Tuesdays on
would
5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
I'll see what I can do. I saw that and I really did want to dig into that one. And
yeah.
I'll see what I can do about that. It might be a good place to plug in.
Oh yeah.
I got a few little things. I got medical things. My wife and I both do. We're trying to negotiate the healthcare system that seems to want us dead, but we're gonna fight tooth and nail. I'm gonna do a Denzel Washington on them if they don't watch out.
I like that.
Oh yeah.
And so don't fucking play. Don't play.
We appreciate you, Andy. We appreciate
All
you, man.
right.
I always enjoy having you on here. I always enjoy having you here.
Oh, thank you so much. I love being here.
Yeah, if you want to
y'all
join
take care.
us,
Okay.
sorry, if you want to join us tomorrow, I just wanted to let you know we use the same Zoom room link as we do for this. So,
Okay, cool.
Oh
Cool.
yeah.
All right.
all
Take
right.
care.
You too, Andy.
See,
Thank
Good
you.
night.
see you, Andy. And as
Uh,
always, all power to the people.
All power to the people.
All power.
All
All
right.
power. Bye, everyone.